Dust blew low over the single dirt road that cut through Red Hollow, carrying with it the dry rattle of distant sage and the smell of an evening storm. The town lay quiet under the fading sun, its wooden storefronts washed in copper light, its people moving slow as if afraid to disturb the heat still lingering in the air. Inside the Crow's Roost saloon, lanterns flickered against smoke-stained walls, and a piano tuned itself out of key in the corner. Most evenings passed without incident, but tonight carried a strange tension, something coiled, waiting. Jace Crowder kicked the saloon doors open with the loud swagger of a man who believed trouble should announce itself. He wasn't famous, not yet, but he wanted to be. A pair of pistols sat holstered at his hips, polished to mirror shine, reflecting the shadows of the room. Behind him trailed his men, 5 Rough Riders who followed him because he spoke loudly and spent bullets freely. Jace scanned the room, searching for someone or something to provoke, and his eyes landed on the old man sitting alone at the far table. Ezekiel Turner sat with the stillness of a weathered statue, his hands resting lightly on the table, his hat brim casting a shadow that hid most of his face. Lean, wiry, and wrapped in a duster that had seen too many miles, he looked like he belonged to a different era, one the world had nearly forgotten. But what drew Jace's attention wasn't the man. It was the rifle leaning beside him, propped against the leg of his chair. A cracked, battered Winchester with scars carved deep into its stock. Jace let out a mocking whistle. Now what in the devil's name is this relic? Look at that thing. Looks like it survived more winters than you, old man. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to Zeke, then to the door, as if reconsidering whether staying was wise. The bartender froze mid-polish, watching with the worried intensity of a man who'd cleaned blood off his floor before. Zeke didn't move, didn't speak. He lifted his glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down with deliberate calm. That silence only emboldened Jace. "I'm talking to you," he said, stepping closer, boots scraping across the wooden floor. "Or maybe you're too deaf to hear. That rifle of yours looks like a child's toy. How many shots you think it's got left before it falls apart?" A man at the bar muttered, just loud enough for Jace to catch, "That rifle ended 45 gunfights." The room went still. Jace's eyebrows lifted with delighted disbelief. 45. 45 men dropped by that crooked stick. He laughed, loud and sharp. "Hell, that's a good one. Who counted? Some drunk with a bad memory." But no one laughed with him. The quiet that followed felt heavy, pressed down by years of whispered stories told after too much whiskey. Tales of a mun who didn't miss. A mun who didn't brag. A mun who killed only when forced but did so with a precision that turned bullets into warnings and warnings into legends. Jace leaned closer, resting his hand on the back of Zeke's chair. "Tell me, old-timer, did you carve a mark for every man you scared? Or is that just decoration to impress children?" The saloon doors groaned as the wind pushed through them, rattling bottles on the shelves. A storm cloud crept across the horizon, shading the room in gray. Someone coughed nervously. Someone else started praying under their breath. Zeke finally shifted, slow enough to make the air hold still. He looked up, and beneath the brim, his eyes were a faded, tired blue, eyes that had seen too many graves, too many choices that never left him in. He let them rest on Jace, steady as a drawn bowstring, then rose from his seat. For a moment, Jace's smirk faltered. Zeke didn't reach for the rifle, didn't speak. He simply stood, slid a few coins across the table for his drink, and walked toward the door. No glare, no challenge, just a quiet step after quiet step. The rifle remained leaning against the chair. It wasn't forgotten. It was left intentionally, like a message. Jace scoffed. "Hey, I wasn't done with you." But Zeke kept walking, pushing through the doors with the gentle ease of a man refusing to be pulled into another man's storm. Outside, thunder grumbled in the distance. Jace's face reddened, the kind of anger that came not from insult but from being ignored. The saloon had expected a fight. Instead, it got something worse, Zeke's indifference. Jace slammed his hand on the table, knocking over a lantern. "You all see that?" he shouted. "Old coward's afraid to answer back." A miner in the corner spoke, voice low. "If he wanted you dead, boy, you wouldn't be standing here jawing dot." That pushed Jace over the edge. "Don't go spreading ghost stories. That old coot's a nobody. Just another wrinkled fool too scared to draw." But the miner didn't look convinced. The bartender didn't either. Nor did the rest of the room. In fact, the more Jace ranted, the more the townspeople looked away, because nothing was more dangerous than a fool who couldn't recognize the shadow he was standing in. Jace grabbed the old man's Winchester and held it up for all to see. "Look at this trash. I've seen fence posts sturdier than." The rifle shook in his grasp, not because of its weight but because his hand trembled. The wood was rough under his fingers, carved with small notches, 45 of them, if one dared count, and each mark felt like a warning pressed against his skin. Jace threw it back against the table, forcing a laugh he no longer fully believed. "I bet the damn thing hasn't fired in years." One of his men stepped beside him. "Boss, maybe leave it be." Jace glared. "You scared of an old story?" "No," the man lied. "Just thinking the storm's coming in. We ought to head out before the roads flood." Jace smirked again, regaining his bravado. "You're right. Let's ride out. And maybe pay the old man a visit while we're at it. Show him what happens when he walks away from me." The gang gathered their hats, casting uneasy glances at the abandoned rifle. Outside, lightning split the sky, lighting up the street where Zeke's silhouette moved steadily through the rain. There was something in his walk, a weight, a memory, a quiet sorrow, but Jace didn't see it. He saw only insult, only a challenge he believed he had earned. The gang mounted their horses, boots sloshing in the rising puddles. Jace pulled his coat tight, soaked by the first sheets of rain. He looked toward the road leading out of Red Hollow, the same road the old man had taken. "Tonight," he said, voice low and full of reckless certainty, "we teach that old ghost he ain't scaring nobody." A rumble of thunder answered him, deep and long as if the sky itself questioned his decision. The men shifted nervously in their saddles. The wind picked up, whipping dust and water through the air. Jace turned toward his men with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's go find Ezekiel Turner." No one spoke. Not even the horses made a sound. As they rode out of town, past shuttered windows and trembling lamps, the people of Red Hollow watched from behind cracks in their doors. Some whispered their prayers. Others shook their heads in grim resignation, because they had seen the old man leave without anger, without rush, without fear. And they understood something Jace Crowder did not. A man who walks away from a fight isn't always running. Sometimes he's remembering the last time he didn't. And sometimes he's giving his enemy one final chance to turn back. But Jace was not the turning back kind. The storm swallowed the gang as they headed toward the desert, lightning flashing behind them like silent warning shots. In the saloon, the battered rifle still leaned against the chair where Zeke had left it, its wooden stock marked with the history Jace refused to believe. 45 gunfights. 45 chances for death to claim him. 45 times it failed. Outside, the storm rolled in darker and heavier, as if the sky knew exactly what was coming. Night settled over the desert like a heavy blanket, thick with the scent of wet dust and the distant growl of thunder. Jace Crowder urged his horse forward, rainwater streaking down his face as he and his gang cut through the narrow canyon that twisted like a serpent through the red rock. Lightning forked above the walls, illuminating their anxious expressions. The canyon amplified every sound, the clop of hooves, the jangle of gear, the muttered curses of men who were no longer sure this was a simple ride of intimidation. But Jace rode with the blind confidence of a young outlaw who believed the world couldn't touch him. The storm made him feel alive, powerful. If the old man had wanted to hide, the desert wasn't big enough. They'd find him. They'd prove a point. "Boss," one rider called, raising his voice over the rolling thunder. "Sure this is wise?" Jace shot him a glare sharp enough to cut through the rain. "It's a ride. That's all. Old man shouldn't have walked away from me." But the way he said it, rough and forced, suggested he needed to convince himself more than his men. The canyon narrowed, walls pressing close enough to make the gang uneasy. Stories clung to these rocks, tales of Apache scouts who moved silently, of outlaws ambushed in the dead of night, of ghosts wandering the ledges. Tonight, every echo sounded like footsteps behind them. When they finally spilled out into the open desert, the storm clouds thinned, revealing a sky where stars punctured the darkness like pins. The rain eased, leaving behind a shimmering world washed clean, except for the tension riding on their shoulders. Red Hollow lay miles behind them, and ahead stretched barren land dotted with sagebrush and jagged silhouettes of distant ridges. The wind whispered across the sand, carrying faint smells, smoke, mesquite, and the cold of approaching dawn. One of the men pointed toward a lone cluster of buildings where lantern light flickered. "That must be his place. Ain't nobody else foolish enough to live this far out." The ranch lay isolated at the base of a ridge, a lonely patch of humanity carved out of endless wilderness. A single house, a barn, a few fences, and a well. The kind of place that belonged to people who wanted to be forgotten, or had too much past trailing them to ever live near town. Jay smirked. Figures he'd hide way out here. Probably scared of his own shadow. Or try to keep something ugly locked away, another muttered, trying to joke but failing. Jace ignored him, spurring his stallion toward the house. A lantern's glow moved inside. Before they reached the gate, the door creaked open and a woman stepped onto the porch. Her hair was tied back, threads of silver catching the moonlight, and her posture spoke of someone who'd weathered too many storms without flinching. Her eyes, however, were tired but steady. She didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't scream. She simply stood between them and her home. "This is Turner land," she said, voice calm and unshaken. "You boys best ride on." Jace laughed, shaking water from his coat. "We just want to talk to the old man. Seems he misplaced his manners in town." "He's not here," she replied. "And you don't want to be here when he gets back." Her warning wasn't shouted. It wasn't desperate. It was spoken like a truth carved into stone. The gang shifted uneasily. Jace dismounted, boots sinking into the damp earth. "Lady, we're just passing through. Thought we'd say hello." She stepped down from the porch, blocking his path. "You don't want to go any farther." "What's he to you?" Jace asked, step by step closing in. She hesitated, and that single pause stirred something strange in the men. Respect? Fear? They didn't know. "He saved my husband's life," she finally said. "Long time ago. Before the world forgot who he was." "But your husband ain't here now, is he?" Jace replied with a cruel smile. "No," she whispered. "He died years later. But if it weren't for Zeke Turner, he'd have died far sooner." The wind tugged at her dress. Ashes, or perhaps dust, drifted on the breeze. Jace waved his hand dismissively. "Sweet story. Doesn't change anything." He nodded to two of his men, who rode past her toward the barn. She moved to stop them, but one shoved her back roughly. She collapsed onto the porch steps, breath knocked out of her. The men lit torches. "Boss, you sure?" one asked, flames dancing in his nervous eyes. Jace didn't answer. His grin said everything. The torches sailed through the barn window. Wood crackled instantly, catching like dry tinder. The fire devoured the shadows, climbing the walls, reaching for the sky. The horses trapped inside screamed and kicked, shaking the barn boards until smoke swallowed their cries. The widow rose, tears blurring her vision as she ran toward the barn, but two men held her back. "Let go," she cried, voice raw. "He'll kill you for this." Jace leaned against the porch rail, arms folded, watching the flames with fascination. He should have thought of that before walking away from me. "You don't understand," she said, shaking, breath ragged. He didn't walk away because he was scared. He walked away because he promised himself he'd never kill again. Jace blinked. Again. "Lady," he couldn't hit the broadside of. "You don't know," she whispered, voice trembling with something closer to dread than grief. No one asked him how many men he spared. Only how many he had to put down. The barn roof caved inward, sparks exploding skyward. Smoke curled into the night like a signal for the dead. Jay stepped down the porch stairs and grabbed a piece of broken board. Using the tip of his knife, he carved words deep into the weathered wood. His strokes were fast, hard, fueled by the growing fear he refused to acknowledge. When he finished, the message stood clear and malicious. "Come find us, Oldman." He tossed the board near the front gate. The gang mounted their horses again. The widow dropped to her knees in the dirt, staring at the burning barn with the hollow expression of someone who'd seen kindness repaid with cruelty too many times. "You've no idea what you've stirred," she whispered as Jay swung into his saddle. He spat into the dust. "Then let him come teach me." They rode away without another word, their silhouettes swallowed by the dark horizon, the only sound the crackling inferno behind them. Hours passed before the wind shifted, carrying the faint thud of approaching footsteps. The widow remained kneeling, face streaked with soot and tears, when Zeke Turner emerged from the shadows of the ridge. He moved slowly, a canvas sack over one shoulder, the stormlight painting his silhouette in pale blue. He froze when he saw the smoke rising from what remained of his barn. His breath hitched, not in panic, but in the deep, quiet ache of a man who'd lost more than structures before. He walked closer, boots crunching over cooled embers. The widow rose shakily. "Zeke, I couldn't stop them," she whispered. He didn't ask who. Didn't ask why. He simply looked at the flames, jaw clenched, and his eyes burned a fury so cold it didn't need words. He approached the carved board, kneeling beside it. His fingers traced the letters. The message wasn't a taunt. It was a mistake. A young man's mistake. A fatal mistake. The widow stepped closer, voice trembling. "What are you going to do?" Zeke lifted the board, stared into the burned remains of his land, and breathed slowly, once, twice, until the night seemed to still around him. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't vow revenge. Silence spoke for him. The wind carried ashes across his boots as he straightened, that old rifle slung over his shoulder once more. He looked toward the horizon where Jace's gang had disappeared, his expression carved from stone. He would follow. Not because of anger, but because some storms didn't pass. They returned. And some men didn't seek violence, but could no longer walk away from it when others left them no choice. Zeke Turner took one step toward the darkness, and the desert wind rose around him like the breath of an old legend waking. The desert was still smoldering when Zeke Turner left his ruined barn behind and set out before dawn. The sky was a pale, bruised purple, caught between night and morning, and the wind carried the faint scent of ash as if trying to cling to him. He didn't hurry. He didn't storm down the trail. He walked with the steady, measured calm of a man who had learned long ago that anger was wasted energy. The tracks his enemies left were fresh, hoofprints pressed deep into damp soil, wagon ruts weaving between them where Jace's men had dragged stolen supplies. The storm had done nothing to erase their trail. Ahead, the desert narrowed into the mouth of a canyon shaped like a twisting serpent frozen in stone. Its walls rose jagged and red, casting long, cold shadows that hid secrets, ambushes, regrets. Zeke paused where the rock swallowed the trail and let his fingers brush the edges of the footprints. The men rode hard, reckless. Jace thought he had won something tonight. Respect. Control. Importance. But all he had truly earned was the attention of the one man he should have left alone. Zeke stepped into the canyon, and the desert swallowed him whole. The walls closed around him, blocking the sky, funneling the wind into whispering breaths. Every footstep echoed faintly before fading into a silence older than memory. The canyon had seen men like Jace before, young wolves eager for blood, thinking themselves immortal. Zeke moved quietly, each movement a lesson learned from a life lived on the edge. He flowed between the stone formations, slipping through the narrow paths with the ease of someone who had spent more nights than years on the frontier, watching shadows, listening to the earth beneath his boots. As he walked, memories stirred, some unwelcome, some carved deep enough to never fade. The canyon reminded him. Once, he had walked canyons like this wearing a badge pinned to his chest, a U.S. Marshal star that had caught the sun like a shard of fire. Back then, his steps carried certainty, duty, a belief that justice could be delivered with a steady hand and a keen eye. And he had delivered it, 45 times in gun smoke, dust, and blood. He had been the man other outlaws whispered about, a ghost in a duster, the one whose rifle never missed. He could still see the faces of the marshals who rode with him, men who joked and laughed and believed they'd see old age. And then his son, just a slip of a boy, 10 years old, following him into town one warm afternoon because he wanted to see his father as others saw him. Strong, unshakable, legendary. But legends draw gunfire. The memory carved through Zeke's chest like a dull knife. A robbery gone wrong. A bullet meant for someone else. The boy's small body collapsing onto the dirt street. Zeke had scooped him into his arms, felt the warmth draining from him. Heard him whisper, "Pa," in a fading voice that haunted every breath Zeke took thereafter. He had not fired his rifle again, not for years. He had buried his boy, folded away the badge, and told himself he'd never shed blood again. He'd chosen exile, chosen silence, chosen the slow life of a man tired of ghosts. But the past had a way of catching up. And tonight, it rode with Jace Crowder's gang. The canyon twisted abruptly, narrowing into a passage barely wide enough for a horse. Zeke stepped lightly over a dusting of sand, freshly disturbed. A trap. He crouched, brushing aside debris to reveal a rope stretched taut beneath the sand. A crude snare, anchored to jagged rock, designed to flip a rider and break a neck. Zeke cut it cleanly with a small knife and draped a rope across the rock for the men behind him to notice if they had sense. He doubted they did. Deeper in the canyon, the trail widened again, revealing hoofprints circling a cluster of stones. Camp. They had stopped here. He moved silently, hugging the wall, his shadow long and thin beneath the moon's pale glow. Around the next bend, voices drifted through the air, low, tense, uneasy. Zeke crouched behind a boulder, watching. Jace's men huddled around a flickering fire, eyes darting into the darkness. Their leader wasn't among them, one more sign that the boy preferred theatrics to true grit. Two men at the edge argued in hushed tones. "He ain't following us," one insisted, though his voice trembled. "Old bastard probably passed out watching his barn burn." Another shook his head. "You didn't see his eyes. That's not a man you poke and walk away from." A third spat into the fire. "So what? He's old. We outnumber him." Zeke let his fingertips brush the rifle slung over his shoulder. The same Winchester from all 45 gunfights, its barrel scratched, its stock cracked. A relic, Jace had called it. But relics carried stories sharper than bullets. He waited until the wind rose, rustling against the canyon walls, masking his movement. Then he slipped closer, ghost-like. He tossed a pebble to his right, letting it clatter loudly across the rocks. The men jumped to their feet, guns drawn. What was that? They spun toward the noise, and Zeke moved. A swift kick knocked one man's pistol from his hand. A second motion, fluid as water, sent another sprawling as Zeke struck the pressure point at the base of his neck. The third tried to fire wildly, but Zeke caught his wrist and twisted until the gun clattered to the ground. Not one shot fired. Not one man dead. Two lay unconscious. The third stumbled backward, wide-eyed and pale. What are you?" he whispered. Zeke said nothing. He stepped back and melted into the shadows again, leaving the men to run screaming deeper into the canyon. By the time the campfire died down to embers, the remaining riders had scattered, their nerves unraveling. Zeke retrieved their dropped weapons and tossed them into a ravine, ensuring none could be used again tonight. He unclasped his canteen, took a slow drink, and kept walking. The canyon grew darker, quieter. Only the occasional owl called above him. The air changed. He could smell their fear wafting through the night like cold smoke. Ahead, past the twisting rock formations, he spotted Jace's stallion tethered to a scrub oak near the canyon's exit. The horse pawed nervously at the ground, sensing something wrong. Jace stood near a small fire, pacing circles, muttering curses into the wind. Sweat glistened on his brow despite the cold. His bravado had thinned, stripped clean by the knowledge that someone far more dangerous than he'd believed, had followed him into the one place he shouldn't be hunted. Zeke watched him for a long moment, letting the silence tighten around them. Jace drew his gun twice just to check if his hand still worked. It trembled both times. Finally, Zeke stepped out from behind the rocks. Jace whirled around, pointing the pistol, eyes wide. The old marshal didn't flinch. His voice was nearly drowned by the wind, barely a breath, yet it carried through the canyon like a verdict. "You chose the wrong men to hunt." Jace staggered back, shaking his head as if trying to banish the voice. "Stay back," he warned, though his voice cracked. I ain't scared of you." Zeke's shadow stretched long in the firelight, broken rifle gleaming faintly. He didn't reach for it. Didn't need to. "You lit fire to my land," he said, tone calm, almost gentle. "Threatened a woman I swore to protect. You carved your challenge into my home." Jace swallowed hard. It was just a message. "Then hear mine," Zeke said, stepping closer, each word carved with a lifetime of loss. "Turn back. Leave these canyons. Leave Red Hollow. You get one chance. Only one." Fear flickered in Jace's eyes, raw, fleeting, followed quickly by the pride that had doomed many men younger and stronger. He lifted his gun again, pretending his hand didn't tremble. "I ain't running," he whispered. Zeke nodded slowly, as if he had expected nothing else. The canyon wind howled between them, sweeping dust across their boots. What happened next would determine how many more gunfights the broken rifle would endure. But tonight, the canyon of wolves waited, listening, patient as death itself. Dawn bled slowly over the desert, turning the horizon from indigo to pale gold. The cold night air still clung to the sand, but the first faint warmth of morning brushed across the ground where Zeke Turner stood, alone and unmoving. Before him stretched a vast, open field dotted with sagebrush and scattered boulders, land wide and empty enough that no man could hide and no light could outrun the daylight. Jace Crowder limped into the clearing with the last of his gang trailing behind him, bruised, shaken, and hollow-eyed. The canyon had worked on their nerves like a slow poison, but pride held Jace upright. Pride, and the simmering anger that refused to loosen its grip on him. His clothes were torn, dusted with grit. His hands still trembled from the memory of being hunted like an animal. Yet he strutted forward as though the desert were his stage. Zeke didn't raise his rifle. He didn't shift his weight or tighten his jaw. He only watched the young outlaw approach, his expression carved from stillness. The battered Winchester rested lightly in his hands, its cracked stock catching the dawn light. Jace forced a grin he no longer believed in. "Well now," he drawled, breath uneven, "seems you and I finally get our little showdown." The wind rolled a wave of sand between them. Jace gestured toward Zeke's rifle. "You think that busted thing's gonna save you? Look at it. Looks like it's held together with spit and prayer. Ain't no way it fires straight." Zeke's gaze didn't waver. "It fires true enough." Jace spat into the dirt. "I doubt it. You've been bluffing with that museum piece the whole way, trying to scare us with stories." He raised his gun, pointing it at Zeke with the confidence of a man desperately clinging to the last scraps of bravado he had left. "Let's see who's bluffing now." The pink edge of sunlight crept over the mountains, painting their faces with the fragile glow of a new day. A hawk cried overhead. The earth seemed to hold still. Jace fired. The shot cracked through the morning air, echoing across the field. Dust kicked up near Zeke's boot. The bullet had missed, not because Jace intended a warning, but because his hand shook uncontrollably. Zeke didn't flinch. Jace fired again, sweat trickling down his forehead. The shot went wide, slicing past a patch of sagebrush. A third attempt clicked empty. He cursed, fumbling to reload while forcing a grin. "See, old man scared stiff," he said, voice trembling. Zeke finally raised the Winchester. There was no dramatic flourish, no slow intimidation. The rifle moved like an extension of his breath, a fluid, timeless motion of someone who had repeated the gesture thousands of times across the harsh, unmerciful frontier. He squeezed the trigger once. The rifle's crack split the silence. Dust exploded near Jace's hand as his gun flew from his grip, skidding across the sand. He yelped, clutching his stinging fingers and stumbling backward. Shock washed over his face. Pure, unfiltered disbelief. You shot the gun right out of my hand," he gasped. Zeke lowered the rifle. "I did." Jace fell to his knees, panting. That ain't possible. Not with that old thing." Zeke stepped forward, boots leaving faint imprints in the softening sand. "This rifle's older than you. Older than most men I've buried. But it has never lied." Jace crawled backward, breath hitching. "You're a monster." "No," Zeke said softly. "Just a man who learned to end things before they began." He lifted the rifle so the dawn light revealed the notches carved deep along its stock, 45 small, uneven marks, each one cut with purpose. "Every mark," Zeke said, his voice roughened by years and sorrow, "is a life taken at the end of a barrel." Jace stared, sweat collecting along his brow. 45. 45 who wouldn't lay down their guns," Zeke replied. 45 who aimed at the innocent. 45 who didn't give me a choice. He ran a thumb over the first mark near the grip. This one was a rustler shoot-in, at a farm girl who never harmed a soul. His finger moved to another. This one, bank robber with a hostage. Another. This, man who boasted he'd put bullets in lawmen just to tally the score. The wind pressed against them, listening. And the last. Jace whispered. Zeke paused. His jaw tightened. A man whose bullet hit someone I loved. Jace's eyes widened. He spoke in a broken whisper. "Your son." Zeke nodded just once. The memory flickered across his face like an old wound reopening. "I stopped shooting after that. Stopped wearing the badge. Stopped trying to carry justice on my shoulders. I swore I would never kill again." Jace swallowed hard. "Then, why come after us?" Zeke stared at him, weary eyes sharpened by pain and years of regret. "Because you threatened a widow, burned my home, and you forced people into fear. I don't kill lightly anymore, Jace, but you crossed the one line I had left." Jace's bravado shattered under the weight of the truth. He looked down, shaking. I didn't know who you were." "That was your mistake," Zeke said. "You hunted a ghost of the West. And the ghost followed." Jace's breath hitched, trembling in his chest. He looked around at the emptiness, at the unforgiving dawn that revealed all truths. "What happens now?" "You ride out," Zeke said, stepping back. You leave Red Hollow. Leave that widow alone. Leave anyone who ain't looking for trouble. You do that, and I'll let you walk away." Jace's eyes flickered with relief. A glimmer of hope. But pride, foolish, childish pride, rose in him like a deadly fever. He glanced at the gun lying half-buried in the sand. Then back at Zeke. "You ain't taking my manhood," he whispered hoarsely. "I ain't crawling away like a coward. Not in front of them." The last of his gang stood frozen at a distance, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Jace lunged toward the fallen gun. Zeke sighed, quiet, heartbreakingly tired. The Winchester lifted one last time. The second shot echoed through the desert, rolling against the canyon walls like thunder. Jace's body spun from the impact, the force knocking him flat on his back. His pistol skidded from his grasp, rolling uselessly into a patch of dust. A hush rippled across the field. Jace lay staring at the sky, chest heaving, eyes wide. He wasn't dead. The bullet had torn through the meat of his shoulder, shattering pride, not bone. His voice cracked. You could have killed me." "I know," Zeke said, lowering the rifle. "But you ain't worth another mark on this gun." Jace's throat bobbed as realization struck him harder than the bullet. "I never stood a chance," he whispered. "No," Zeke replied with cold honesty. "But you had a choice. And you made the wrong one." The young outlaw closed his eyes, tears leaking down his temples. Not from pain, but from knowing the legend he mocked had shown him mercy he did not deserve. Zeke turned away, boots crunching softly as he walked toward the rising sun, leaving the boy who thought himself a wolf lying broken in the dust. Behind him, the desert held its breath. Justice had spoken, and it carried the echo of a single, unforgettable shot.